Have you ever wondered how College Football 25 determines the overall ratings for all of these teams? Like, is there some hidden formula to get to that number right there from all of the overalls from these players? And do certain positions matter more than others? Well, it took a while, but I hand collected every single overall for every single offensive starter for 69 different teams, all to answer one question. How does College Football 25 calculate a team's overall rating? Now, for context, we are only going to be talking about the offensive overall, not the team overall. I feel like this should be a lot easier for us to understand with the players. Plus, if we can understand offense pretty well, then we could probably replicate that to defense. But what I found might surprise you, or if you're like me, it might disappoint you. So for starters, I began with the simplest way of trying to predict the team's offensive overall. What if we just grabbed the 11 starters that are usually on the field, took their average overall rating for those 11 guys, and used that one number to predict the team's offensive overall? Well, it turns out that gets us about 60% of the way there. In other words, we can understand about 60% of the variation between your team's offensive overall rating just by taking a simple average of the 11 starters and their overall rating. Now, as this chart shows you, that's pretty solid. Each little point on this chart is one of those 69 teams, and if we were to predict their overall rating for the offense, exactly what it actually was, it would be right on that dotted red line. So obviously not every point is right on that line, but the general trend is there. Like, yeah, we may have thought that this specific team was going to be an 84 overall, when in reality their offense was only a 77. But either way, that looks pretty solid. But if you just take a simple average of the 11 players, that is kind of like saying that you think the quarterback matters just as much as the overall of the left guard. But I'm guessing you don't think that, and I definitely don't think that either. So what if we split out those 11 positions? In other words, we make another model, this time with all 11 positions differently, so we can understand which one of them is the most important and which one of them are less important. In theory, using these 11 separately should help a model understand which positions kind of matter a little bit more than others. Well, what happened? I don't know. You tell me. This is the chart of the original one where we just took the averages, and this is the newer fancy one where we broke out all 11 positions. Doesn't seem to be a whole lot of difference. And the numbers agree. Last time we said we could explain about 60% of the variation in the team's offensive overall, and now we can explain about 61%. So while some of these teams may have shifted around a little bit, the general cloud of teams is still kind of following the same pattern. Now, one weird thing I did find was that the single largest effect from one of the 11 positions is not coming from quarterback, but is instead coming from the wide receiver one. Now, that is not saying that wide receiver is more important than quarterback to predict the team's offensive overall, because we might be missing something here, but it's still interesting. Actually, you want to see something sick? You know how I said we could get about 60% of the way there either by just averaging the 11 offensive starters or by just breaking them out individually? Well, we could actually get about 48% of the way towards understanding the team's offensive overall just by predicting it based off of the overall of your starting wide receiver. Now again, I'm not saying that all of this is being driven by the wide receiver position group, because maybe there's something else happening behind the scenes. Like, think about all the 5 stars that show up in recruiting classes, and receivers tend to make up a lot of those 5 stars. So maybe elite receivers tend to be highly ranked, and only elite schools can get those 5-star receivers. Therefore, if a linear model sees a super good receiver, that's probably a sign not only that the receiver is good, but that it's an elite school and everybody else is good too. So again, I can't say that receiver is all that matters, but it is really interesting to note. But all right, I actually got more than just these starting 11, because if you play in a fancy offense that doesn't run with just one tight end and one running back, I don't have your starting 11, right? So I also grabbed the 2nd string halfback, the starting fullback, and the 4th string wide receiver. So let's add in those 3 guys into that original model where we broke out all 11 positions, and now we have 14 offensive players. Even after adding those 3 guys, the model is not any better. We still can get about 60% of the way towards understanding the team's offensive overall. In other words, whether your backup running back is a 91 or a 73, it's not going to change all that much. So at this point, I'm a little lost. There is a theory that some of y'all have told me where if you just take the average of every single offensive player on the entire roster, that's the quickest way to understand the team's overall, which I would strongly disagree with if that's true. Like, why would the 7th string wide receiver contribute as much to your team's offensive overall as the starting quarterback? But as of right now, that has not been disproven, right? Like we've been able to see that doesn't make a difference whether it's 11 positions broken out, 14 positions broken out, or just 11 positions lumped together into one. You're understanding the team's offensive overall about the same amount. But I think we've been missing two key things. First of all, what if the overall isn't necessarily linear? You know, like an 86 quarterback to an 88 quarterback is not nearly as big a jump as an 88 quarterback to a 90 quarterback, even though they're both two overall better, right? And also, we have not been accounting for the scheme of the offense. Like, I guess in theory, and if you and I were, playing this game, I would think that the fourth string wide receiver would matter a lot more if you're running an air raid offense than if you're running a flex bone offense. Because, the fourth receiver is never going to see the field if you're playing as Navy. So what if we try to include both of those? Let's include the scheme of the offense, and let's also account for like non-linear relationships where sometimes a jump in two overall matters a lot more than others. In other words, let's make a decision tree. Well, when I tried to include both of those, again, nothing. This basic decision tree that I'm showing you is just about as good at predicting the team's offensive overall as all the other methods in the past. And unfortunately, we also aren't seeing the positions that I thought would matter, right? Like I really thought that the most important thing would be the overall of the quarterback. And also, what you don't see in this decision tree is any mention of scheme. In other words, if you played in a flex bone offense and your quarterback was 83 versus you played in an air raid offense and your quarterback was 83, I would think that that would matter a lot as far as the actual gameplay, but scheme doesn't show up as far as one of the 3 or 4 most important things to understand overall. Now, I don't think this tree is super informative, and my main takeaway is actually the fact that the single most important position, being the third string wide receiver, does kind of signal to me that maybe it's just kind of like looking for like a depth play. Like if the third string receiver is at least this overall, and then your right tackle's half good, all of a sudden we think you're awesome. And I think that might be because teams with a really good third receiver probably have a really good everything else, and teams with a good right tackle probably also have a good left tackle and everything else, because if your right tackle was great and your left tackle sucked, that right tackle would probably be playing left tackle, right? So again, it's a little disappointing to not see anything about scheme showing up as being relevant or the quarterback position. So I know this was a lot of different ways of looking at this. So what's the conclusion here? Well, as of right now, I'm personally pretty confident that the scheme of the offense you're running and the actual positions don't really matter, I guess, to predict the team's offensive overall. Again, right now, it seems like you can understand a team's offensive overall just as well by using the just simple average of all the players as breaking it out and doing all this fancy stuff. So really, my biggest takeaway is that I need to go and do this again for 100 more schools so we can test some more of the fancy non-linear stuff, but also so we can go and test your guys' theory that maybe the best way to predict the team's offensive overall is to just take the average of all the 45 offensive players on the roster. So I'm gonna need a few days to go and do that. But in the meantime, I'd love to hear your theories as far as how EA is actually determining a team's offensive overall. So hopefully this was a half decent part 1. Thank you so much for watching, but I gotta go work on part 2 here. Peace out.